Good afternoon. I'm Al Kresta. On June 22nd, the feasts of St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher, the USCCB kicked off Religious Freedom Week. And my guest thinks that's good, but there's still a lot of work to be done. My guest is Helen Alvare. She holds the Robert Levy Endowed Chair in Law and Liberty at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. She also teaches courses on family law, law and religion, and property law. She publishes on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, and the First Amendment religion clauses, and is a member of the Holy See's Dicastery for Laity, Family, and Life. She's the author of a new book called Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution, and I think this could be change the way that Catholic representatives even present themselves in legal pleadings and in public statements. And Helen, it's great to have you here. Thank you.
I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
You point out at the very beginning what I think we all know, but don't often consider its significance, and that is it wasn't too long ago that there was a broad consensus about sexual responsibility in America. With the exception of contraception, the Catholic view on sexual matters, pretty unremarkable. There's a lot of overlap with non-Catholic Christians and even men and women of goodwill. The consensus begins to break down, I assume, with the widespread use of the pill and then access to abortion. Why did it break down? Why did the consensus break down?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think it was sort of the interaction of law and culture back and forth is how I see a lot of it. Mm-hmm. You know, we already, as a country, have issues, it's a nice way of putting it, with very dramatic individualism, with materialism. We already were people whose, you know, even when the churches were very full, weren't necessarily, experiencing a personal relationship with God and letting Him direct our lives. There were other issues in the country. You remember the youth revolution in the 60s and 70s. There was the
I've still got scars from that. So.
Right. That reaction against institutions. There's also, scientism, the idea that science explains everything and no other explanation, including supernatural ones, matters. And the combination of this, as it interacted with, in the United States, the separation of sex from kids, the separation of sex from marriage, the separation of marriage from kids, and so on, that happened in the legal opinions, back and forth, sort of reconfirming the worst aspects of each other, to the point where, and then you add some very practical factors, the huge money and increasingly sort of elite support for the separation of sex from marriage and kids. And the idea that anything that oppressed human desire, an institution, a religion, the family, anything that was a given, marriage, a person's sex, the relationship between sex and the fact that it brings new life, was not acceptable to us any longer. And this was already stirring in the culture. There's a terrific book by a guy named Carl Trueman that really puts that together. Yep. And, you go from the individual to the individual as primarily sexual to the sexual as political, and you get where we are today, which is really a very dramatic rejection of sort of some basic biological and social realities. And it's a huge stew, but it has, as one of its main effects, is a very severe rejection that we're seeing now of all Catholic and what used to be sort of commonly accepted American familial norms.
Right. And so is it this idea that liberation or emancipation from traditional norms and standards is what makes for human flourishing? Is that part of it?
Very much so. I mean, the idea that anything given is not is not worthy of the human person.
Yeah.
No. We're free. We're independent. We make our own lives. We are self-made men and women. You may remember that it was a great theme of Pope Benedict's to say, wait a minute, all these things that you are representing as external constraints, pressures, demands, the big no, coming from the church or the structure of the family, are actually internal needs and desires that the person has, and the church, and up to a certain point in history, the state, are simply acknowledging what is already true and obvious.
Yeah.
But even these things became rejected.
Yeah. I remember when divorce became popular in the late 60s, but into the 70s in particular, and then through the 80s. And then the social science evidence began to come in. When I was a kid, it was common to say, well, divorce is better for the children, better than growing up in a bickering household, better that the parents separate. Then the social science data came in saying, wait a minute, there are real problems with adult children of divorce. Are we going to see the same thing here?
You've hit on some good news. So some of the marriage of faith and reason that is a hallmark of Catholic Christianity is so very, very evident in the realm of the family. And sociology and psychology and biology have become some of our best friends right now. Yeah. So in the same way that, like in the early 90s, you saw the questioning of what had become the standard line that divorce was always better for personal happiness and for the children, began to alter. And we began to learn, for example, that most divorces do not happen after a tremendous amount of internal bickering and dissension in the household. There are some that do, and there's a lot of discussion about in some cases, children really do need to be removed from that. Of course, the Catholic Church would say, let's try to do that short of divorce. The evidence now is beginning to come in on cohabitation. You even have evidence of the difficulties that cohabiting couples later face when they get married. Their risks for divorce are greater. The difficulties that individuals, particularly who have serially cohabited, which is now, I don't know, I think it's something like 40% of all cohabitants have cohabited before. And it undermines happiness, certainty, a sense of confidence in one's spouse. It leads to relationship models as testing models instead of as a commitment that leads to action to affirm the commitment. Now we're seeing this in the realm of transgender surgeries, and it's happening more quickly. The backlash is popping up. The question of not only the well-being of young people, but also older people who go through this, and the physical suffering and the psychological suffering that they're experiencing. We know so much more scientifically that is affirming the Church's reaction to this, and it happened way faster than the backlash to divorce. So the only place that I don't see significant questioning is with regard to same-sex relations and marriage. That seems to be a bridge too far, and I'm really not seeing that. But elsewhere, there is more searching inquiry, and you see misgivings in places as widespread as, the Atlantic Monthly or Newsweek or sort of more mainstream things. And this is a good thing.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we do believe that a Catholic way of life leads to human flourishing, broadly spoken. And so we should expect that there would be some empirical evidence in favor of that, some measurables.
Yes. And the difficulty, of course, in the scientific academic world is allowing researchers doing really good research to publish. They are often just kept out of the journals if they come up with a conclusion that is not to everybody's liking in sort of elite circles. Or if they are allowed to publish, the attacks on them the attempts to get them fired from their universities or to, make sure they never get tenure or that they are never really permitted to publish again is very, very strong. It's for being as I am in an academic environment, I see this in legal journals, and I think it's very, very strong in the scientific journals as well.
That kind of flies in the face of the kind of naive view, I guess, we had of academic work, that you were always supposed to be open to new information. But are professional guilds now requiring a certain orthodoxy of its members?
Yes. I think the short answer is yes. There is a backlash. I mean, this huge debate we're having over what is free speech and what's it for and who really supports it is a good debate. I don't like to be a person who just says, "Oh, polarization is terrible." Having fights is terrible. No, you need to have a big old conversation, and sometimes it's a tough one about differences. But in the academic arena, I can tell you in the legal arena, the University of Chicago took a stand in favor of free speech. My school, the Antonin Scalia Law School, is right in there taking a stand for free speech. Just as a beautiful example, after the Dobbs opinion came down in 2022, most law schools put out a statement that said, the world as we know it is over. Women are returned to a phoneless, dateless, 17th century existence. It's all over for them. And my law school put out a note that said, hey, we're going to have a debate on this.
Right.
And we're going to have the woman who argued the Casey decision and the leading pro-life feminist in the United States right now, and we're going to have a debate on it. And we're waiting for the Supreme Court this week to issue an opinion on the free speech of a website designer who refrained from creating one to celebrate a same-sex wedding. I think the free speech will win in this case. And again, my law school and some others will say, hey, we're going to have a debate on this. And we've got scholars on both sides. And one hopes that people's better angels understand that this is really a great idea and they like it.
Yeah. Helen, hold it there. We're going to have to take a break. We'll come back and continue the conversation. My guest is Helen Alvare, Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution. It is outstanding work and may well be one of those books that changes the nature of the debate. We'll talk a little bit about how Catholics can be presenting themselves. And good afternoon, I'm Al Kresta. With me is Helen Alvare. She holds the Robert Levy Endowed Chair in Law and Liberty at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University and has published Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution, which gives us really an agenda for the future and how we present ourselves in the public square as Catholics. I want to go to your about this whole question of Catholic identity. But before we go there, I just have to ask you, 1992, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and that famous passage that Justices O'Connor, Kennedy, and Souter signed on to, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life, end quote.
You're at a loss.
Yeah, you look at that and you say, well, that means family's insignificant to this question. I mean, that seems to be about as vacuous a statement as one can find, or exceedingly individualistic. And then they used it again, right? I mean, didn't they use that in Lawrence v. Texas?
And they used it in the Obergefell opinion.
They did. Okay.
Inventing the right to same-sex marriage, yes.
Doesn't it seem this is a solipsistic universe, apparently? I mean,
yes.
I don't get that. The individual exists entirely autonomous here. He's
yes.
not part of a community. And how is this passage generally regarded in the legal world?
It has various fun names in the legal world. Some of it call it Justice Kennedy's "Ah, Sweet Mystery of Life," passage. It's kind of Justice Kennedy in a nutshell. Other people just call it the wacko passage.
Yeah.
It has been repudiated in Dobbs. What that passage was attempting to do, other than, find any basis it could find in a storm to persist with the legal right to abortion.
Right.
Its legal purpose was to say, listen, and I don't want to be too boring here, but 14th Amendment to the Constitution says, people have the right to life, liberty, and property, and it can't be deprived without due process. Mm-hmm. Well, the question is, what is liberty?
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court over years has said it's not just a right to fair process, right to notice of the charges against you and cross-examination. No, it has substantive rights. So the Supreme Court has been mucking around for, over 100 years with defining what are the substantive rights liberty contains. They've been most active in the sexual realm. The first one they named in our time was the right to contraception. The next one was the right to abortion. The next one was the right to have consensual sex with anyone you want, same or opposite sex. The next one was the right to same-sex marriage. But then, and how did they do that? Well, they had to define, there was obviously nothing in the Constitution that says anything about any of those things. Right. So they had to come up with a description of rights as they understood them, as 5 out of 9 justices understood them, that they thought would encompass whatever people wanted to do with regard to sex, marriage, or parenting. Oh. And that was what Justice Kennedy came up with. He said, that's liberty. Well, interestingly, and don't get me off on this legal tangent too long, but when it came time for the euthanasia folks to say, hey, that includes euthanasia, because if that isn't about defining the meaning of my life, I don't know what it is, the court went, nah, we didn't actually mean it that way. Okay. And then along comes Dobbs finally and says, that's just dicta, meaning it is not an important dispositive part of the opinion.
Okay.
It's not really constitutional law. It's sort of bad poetry. And it's not law. And actually, when you want to find what the word liberty means in the Constitution, it clearly can't be invented by 5 guys at the Supreme Court. So you have to look to the history and traditions of the people and see what Americans have always understood liberty to involve.
Yeah.
And at that point, the court says, in Dobbs in particular, listen, the people had never allowed abortion on demand until Roe versus Wade commanded it. It's not what they voted in their laws. It's not what they favored even in legal journals. It's clearly not part of liberty. Yeah. So they have completely repudiated that definition.
Very good.
As of Dobbs. It's history.
I'm also curious here. You mentioned the initial reaction to Dobbs was to say that we're going back to a time where women were to be barefoot and pregnant.
Yes.
But that's clearly not the case. I mean, as any pro-life activist will tell you.
So I, along with a couple of other law professors and Erica Bacchiacchi, a well-known pro-life feminist writer, Teresa Collette, Elizabeth Kirk, we put together a brief representing 240 women with terminal degrees, PhD, JDs, MDs, and we gathered the evidence to show that there was absolutely no proof, unlike Casey had tried to say, or Roe had tried to say, that abortion is linked to women's flourishing.
Yeah.
That in fact, what would be linked to women's flourishing are things that actually support women, including allowing them to accept children and not to have the pain of abortion, the regret of abortion, the aftermath of abortion. Yeah. And we actually showed that in the years when abortion rates and ratios were declining, that is, number of abortions per 1,000 women and abortions per, total number of pregnancies, that during that time when abortion rates and ratios were dropping like a stone from mid-1990s to about 2020, that every indicia of women's well-being was climbing. more education, more entrepreneurship, more health, more representation in as candidates and judges. No one can prove that abortion rates correlate with women's well-being. The best evidence, in fact, coming from self-described pro-choice scientists who were not happy what they found, a famous guy named David Ferguson in particular, is that overall abortion harms women more than it benefits them. Oh. Not a surprise, let alone what it does to the child, of course.
Yeah. Let me switch gears a bit here to get to the point that you make repeatedly in this new book, Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution, and that is that while we've been winning oftentimes on religious liberty grounds, we haven't necessarily been using the most effective means.
Yeah.
So our Catholic identity, oftentimes we kind of minimize our Catholic identity, looking for some freedom which is universally applicable. But Catholic identity, you write, means more than having crucifixes on the wall. It requires that we be an integrated community of witness to Christ, and that we need to be forthright, that we oppose the sexual expressionism of the culture, and we actually, in our legal pleadings, we present a compelling vision of God's plan for sexual expression.
Yeah.
So tell me how this is. That this could constitute a new chapter in the way Catholics argue in the courts.
I wrote this book as a service to Catholic institutions and people who wish to speak as individual advocates. It was my impression, as you said, that we were winning individual religious freedom cases, but maybe losing the public's regard. Mm-hmm. And that I wanted to propose two things. One, that nobody wants to give religious freedom to people they think are going to do bad things.
Right.
So we have to convince people that what it is that we want to do with this freedom is a beautiful thing and for the common good, that it's loving, that it's good for people, especially the vulnerable. Second, we were struggling to convince people that our Catholic institutions should care about the sex, marriage, and parenting stuff. I summarize this in a part of the book that I headline, "Shut Up and Sing," which is people say to our Catholic institutions, could you just shut up and provide health care? What do you care if the doctor performs abortions elsewhere? Right. Could you just shut up and provide education? What do you care if the guidance counselor is same-sex married? Mm-hmm. And what I needed to point out was two things. There's a chapter in the book that I really love that points out that the leading empirical called social influence literature shows that institutions rise or fall with the integrated witness of their employees. So that was one. The other is I needed to show the relationship between the charitable, educational, healthcare, social services work that we do and the stance that we take on sex, marriage, and parenting. Yeah. The stances that we take in sex, marriage, and parenting are not some unrelated moralistic principle, unrelated to the rest of our loving social justice witness. Yeah. In fact, they are an expression of the Good Samaritan's care for the other person, where, I might add, most of us are actually going to have the opportunity to express it. Most people are not saving strangers in large numbers across the globe, but they can save or harm a person in their familial realm. Yeah. It's also the case that we know that the image of marriage, the love between a man and woman, love between a parent and child, are fundamental images for Catholics for beginning to understand God is Trinity,
That's
the
right.
unity in the multiplicity, what God's love looks like, how we're supposed to love Him and one another. The family is the architecture of love. And that architecture is no different between our showing it to romantic partners, spouses, children, and our showing it to third parties. In every case, it's first and foremost about showing radical love, showing the priority of God, respecting the human body, human creation, and that you just cannot put the slightest crack between our teachings on love for romantic partners, spouses, children, and our love for third parties in social settings. We can't understand our love for God and one another unless we live them and experience it in the family. Yes, hospitals, schools, social services have to care that this vision of love is preserved, because it's no different than the vision of love that constitutes the architecture of their charity.
Yeah. Wow. Now, so we should accept. I mean, that's a voice that is going to be unfamiliar.
Yes.
And so we should. I mean, do you like the phrase countercultural? Is that?
Do I like that phrase? Yeah, a little. We can't just be like defensive. We really believe our teachings are for the common good.
Right.
And we really believe that unless we understand this architecture of love that God has given each of us to experience in our families as a way of understanding how we show it in the world, we're in trouble as a Catholic Church. And I think we need to be positive and confident about that, and not just, please give us our religious freedom so we can witness to things you hate.
Yeah, right. Yeah, recently the Catholic Lawyers Society of Metropolitan Detroit objected to a rule requiring the use of personal pronouns in Michigan courts, and they spent a lot of time actually presenting a Catholic worldview before they got to the particular legal pleadings, and I thought that was interesting. Yeah.
Brilliant. And it does help people. We don't know who's hearing us.
Right.
But it's important to do it positively and lovingly, and someone will hear you.
Amen. Helen, thanks so much for all your work, and
thank you.
Really excited by the book, too. So
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Helen Alvare. It's called Religious Freedom After the Sexual Revolution, a Catholic Guide. And again, rarely do I see a book that I believe actually has the potential to change the way things are.